All right, our next order of business is a discussion on building consolidation. This has to do with a May 19th, 2014 annual election, non-binding ballot question, directing the boards to conduct a study. Should the Hull School Committee and the Hull Capital Planning Committee be instructed to conduct an independent space needs study of the Hull Public Schools in calendar year 2014 to determine the feasibility of consolidating students into two schools and turning the third school back to the control of the town of Hull for non-educational use? That was approved 757 to 463 with 150 blanks. So, Mr. Lemios?
Well, I mean, basically, this the ballot question was put forward to the voters. As indicated in the question, I think about 55.2% of the votes were a yes vote, 33.8 were no, and the blanks were 11%. So just gives you a statistical snapshot as to the outcome of the question. Subsequent to this question being placed on the ballot, there was a presentation by the school committee and the administrators to the selectmen, the advisory board, general public, and that was in April, where the administrators of the school department, I think, made a fairly impassioned presentation, and using a fairly long PowerPoint presentation to indicate that they did not think that the idea of consolidation would be in the best interest of the students that they're charged with educating. And I think that's where the rub is. The question is that, in my mind, one of the issues that needs to be addressed is if we're asking the organization in general to go through a big change, then we have to have partners that want that change to occur. Because if you have an element of the partnership that has legal authorities and has degrees of autonomy, meaning that it cannot be compelled to change, and they do not believe that that change is necessarily consistent with what their charge is, and they're elected to carry out that charge, I think that you could set yourself up for a period where you study that change and you look at that change, but ultimately you get to the end of the day and the folks that have to implement a good portion of that change, and clearly the element of the change that would have the longest lasting impact, meaning the education of children. I mean, the space component of this discussion, I think, is, it's a mechanical exercise. It's okay, you've got this many square feet here, you've got this many square feet here, how do you fit, these things into the square footage? The most important element of the discussion is what is the operational impact, and what is the impact to the folks that are receiving the service. And right now, the way I read it, you've got the folks that would experience the greatest degree of operational change not believing that this is a wise move to do. And that in and of itself is an important point, but on top of that, there is no methodology. Let's say you said, well, okay, we respect that, but the but does not have any legal authority, because the school committee is elected and charged with one responsibility, and that's to educate the children of this community in the manner that they see fit and consistent with the resources that are available. So, I mean, I think that we could spend probably a lot of money doing a space study, and I think the space piece of it is actually the easiest element of it, quite frankly, because that's just kind of saying, I've got to, again, so many square feet, I've got so many people, I've got to have so many square feet per person, and we can, that's just moving blocks around. The real question that I think everybody has to address head on in some fashion is if there's a piece of the equation that just does not believe it's in the best interest of the community to do, and you don't have any way to compel that group to do it. And quite frankly, even that word compel is a dicey thing, because you have to have motivated educators. And if people are not motivated to adopt a plan, then I don't think realistically you're going to get the outcome. So, you can always win a battle but lose a war. And, when everything is said and done, we are a service organization, and there's a charge that the school committee has, and I don't believe, and I know from the administrator's point of view, and we have a school committee member here tonight, but I'm not going to put him on the spot, but I know from many of us were at that presentation in April, and I think I think the administrators were very clear and emphatic into what their opinion of this was. I don't think there was any ambiguity on it. So I think that's what has to be taken into the mix, that, and how that divide is crossed, or if the divide can be crossed, because, it's sometimes hard to change beliefs. And
Yeah, a couple of questions. I mean, I'll risk it and speak for the board. I'm sure the board would like to comply with the vote as was taken in a non-binding referendum. However, my main concern is, as Phil already alluded to, we're dealing with a board that has already said that they had a presentation and they didn't show that they were willing to go against what their administrators had presented, and they felt that it was in their best interest and that of the students to keep it as is. So my question is, if we did go ahead and do the study anyways, number one, the cost, where the money would come from, what's the shelf life of the study? So if we were to do it this year, and let's say there's a turnover on the board in a year, 2 years, 3 years, if they can pull that study out and do it then, or if the enrollment projections should still continue to go down and pretty much they're forced into having to make a change, will that study still have some shelf life to do its value? And
I can address
I have
some
a
of
couple more afterwards. But
the shelf life, I think on the space component is, got some stability to it, because again, that's I think the easiest element of this is, how many square feet do you need for a building department? How many square feet do you need for, a town manager, or whatever the case may be? I mean, that stuff is pretty static. The shelf life for the educational component of a study, I think, is a question, because there are changes in state standards to educational policy that come along every so often. If you look at, if we were to be constructing these schools today, there would be some changes in the design today versus what they were 10 years ago because of state requirements. So there are changes in state educational policy that drive, access to types of labs, drive access to data centers, that drive minimum square foot requirements for students, any number of things. And then on top of that, even without state requirements, from time to time, local school committees, will say, geez, we want to be more aggressive on this particular educational objective or another. So I'll give an example. If you recollect, when the high school was being redesigned, the superintendent at that time, not our current superintendent, and the school committee at that time said, look, we really aren't interested in vocational education. And they sold off all of the vocational items in the shop. They showed all the equipment and so forth. And as a matter of fact, there was a local resident, Augie Augustern, who was a vocational educator, I think in Canton, as I recollect, who was very, very vocal and said, I think this is a huge mistake. There's a big value to vocational education. And he proved to be kind of correct in some respects, that there is a different element of vocational education at the schools, that it's more centered on, computers and robotics and things of this nature. But that space that was originally kind of said, well, we don't need that space, we can use it for something else and don't bother to do anything of it, came back into vogue. Okay? So, I think the shelf life of educational studies is not particularly long, because you can have external changes to those studies. I mean, the Common Core is one thing that's going on nationally, where that settles out as educational policy. It's very controversial. Then there's state changes that can occur on policy levels that drive what schools do and have to do. And then there's local decisions. So all of those things kind of drive your educational plan. And what I think we can say with certainty is that the educational plan today to educate children in Hull, or anywhere else for that matter, is different than it was 5 years ago, and it's different yet again than what it was 10 years ago. So, for instance, the big push, I think one of my observations is the big push, and I'm not speaking as anybody with any kind of direct knowledge, I'm just speaking generally, but I mean, there's been a big push to try to get technology into schools in the last 5 years. I mean, to get laptops, or to get notebooks or laptops or something, into every student's hands and so forth. Well, that creates in itself its own cost center, because now you have to staff up an IT component. You have to staff up things as simple as you have to have charging carts. Nobody had a charging cart 5 years ago, but you have to have a cart that kids can plug in and charge their devices. All of these things kind of cascade into a different set of needs and a different set of objectives. So I would say that of the two studies that you would have to do at a minimum, or the study portion A, portion B, however you want to describe it, the space component has got more stability because that's just kind of a numbers game and a square footage game. And quite frankly, the enrollment in Hull will not shift dramatically one way or the other quickly. It will shift over time because there are no big subdivisions coming online or anything that would drive, bringing another 100 kids. The town of Franklin, for instance, went through a period because they extended the rail line out there. It went through a period where it had just astronomic growth. They were getting extra state aid because they were, seeing 10, 15% annual growth in their student enrollment. But Hull, because of the nature of its land use and so forth, will have incremental changes over time, and that's exactly what's happened. I mean, there used to be, I think, about 1,587 kids in the system maybe 15 years ago, and we're down to probably just under 1,100 now, something along those lines. And that's just drifted down over time. And, so just as it's drifted down over time, if it's going to change, it will drift back up over time. So the shelf life of the study, first, the educational piece is questionable. The cost for the studies will be driven by, the biggest element of the cost will be driven, again, by what you want to study educationally. The space piece of it, is probably a relatively finite cost because it's an architect. It's, architect doing, head counts and things of this nature and just saying this is how you kind of configure your space. The educational piece, it's difficult to say what that cost would be initially because it will be driven by how many folks are involved in developing that RFP, what are the things you're looking to study, how broad do you want the study to be, what are those elements. But I would expect that you would see these studies to be in the $100,000 to $150,000 range, to get this stuff studied. We do have a funding source. We have a bond issue that was put in place several years ago to allow us to study town building usage and so forth. So the funding component is there, but that bond issue is also there for the purposes of repairing buildings and things of this nature as well. So, that's the choice you have to make of how you want to use that. Your second to last question was you had space study, shelf life, cost.
Oh, there was also another, we had talked about a financial report to see how much savings there would be on both sides of the ledger for the school department and for town. Yeah. Not just for operational wise, but also for capital planning.
That would probably be a de minimis cost to get that done. You'd hire an accounting firm that could capture. We would provide a lot. Both departments could, the town and general government and the school department could figure out some baseline costs, and then you'd have an accounting firm probably iron that out. That's probably a $5,000 or $10,000 event. I mean, that's not a particularly complex study. That's just a cost accounting element, and quite frankly, the cost accounting element on that, some of the components are pretty straightforward, heating costs and utility costs and things of this nature. The place where you get a little bit of complexity, and this would be driven in part by the education piece, is, what do you want to do with staffing? So, for instance, if you had a consolidated elementary school that went K through 6, and then you had a high school that was 7 through 12, would you have one principal and two vice principals? Would you have two principals still in place? Those are educational studies. That will be driven in part by the educational component, not necessarily the space study, and that's would help drive where those costs ultimately settle out. The other place where you probably have a little bit of complexity to kind of figure out would be the bus aspect of it. How would you run your buses, and would you actually save money in consolidated routes and things of this nature? But I think the staffing component would be the area that, administrative staffing component would be the area that you'd have, some choices to make.
How much was that total bond that we did for the buildings?
I want to say it was about $1 million. I think it was $1 million or $1.1 million.
That was for the highway barn and the library.
Highway barn, we're doing library, we've done work,
Senior
senior center roof, we're doing the fire station work, we've done work in this building for furnaces and things. We've got the first town hall that needs an extensive renovation. Exterior, there's got a lot of work on the exterior portion of that building, and there's still work to be done at the library in terms of the exterior shingling and so forth.
Okay. Would it be possible, it's just an idea, I think we should probably select a couple of members from the board to go speak with a couple of members from the school committee see if anything has changed on their committee or what they're thinking before we go into spending the money, but would it be possible to put something on an upcoming town meeting warrant that would fund this? I mean, there was no cost parameters put onto this motion, and I think people would have to think twice if we said it could cost up to $150,000 to fund the study. And especially with that question mark over, you could do this study, but there's no mechanism to force the changes. And I just don't want to see 25 people's tax bill go to something that's going to sit on the shelf and never be used.
Well, I think there is not a value to having studies sit on a shelf and collect dust. So, I mean, this is the kind of a project, and, you know, I'm an advocate of the project in from a cost avoidance perspective in terms of, you know, what you'd have to do to renovate buildings and so forth. But it's the kind of a process that you need to have, you know, the major groups that are involved on board, because everybody has a role in it. And when I say the major groups, the selectmen have to be on board, the advisory board has to be on board, the school committee has to be on board, and the capital committee has to be on board. And people have to have a defined vision of what they want to accomplish and you know, go that way. And, you know, right now, I don't know where the advisory board is on it one way or the other, and I wouldn't presume to ask them and put Dave on the spot on that. But I think the one thing that has to be recognized in this process is that the agency or the department that has, in some respects, the largest operational impact is clearly the school committee. And, you know, I saw those administrators, and, you know, whether people can accept what they said or not accept what they said, but they believe what they said. And they do believe that this concept is antithetical to their mission. And, you know, that chasm has to be either bridged or accepted as the fact. And if, you know, you can't get all the parties moving in the same direction, you cannot accomplish this goal.
So do we have, just in answer to one of your questions, do we have two members of the Board of Selectmen who are on that capital planning committee?
Yes.
Who are they?
Me and Kevin.
Okay, so it would make sense that you would be the two that would meet with.
Yeah, that, if you want to do it as chair and another member.
It's fine either way. We can talk about that, but does anyone else want to be part of that?
I want to, if I could add one more thing. I mean, I know that, you know, there are lots of folks, obviously. There are 757 folks who voted to see this happen. And that's a strong desire, and that represents a, you know, significant vote tally. But we also have to, and I'd like to see it happen because I think that it has value. But by the same token, you know, I think I know enough about change and know enough about what the limits of authorities are and so forth to recognize that this is not a top-down decision. It just isn't. It's a decision. I mean, the school committee has a role in it, and they're a separately elected body, and they have, you know, authorities under the law that, you know, again, you know, have to be respected.
Just one more comment. I think if I was on the school committee and knowing the charge that I would have, if it was presented to me in a way that if these changes were to occur, and it would free up more money for the educational purposes and maybe provide a better product for the students and for the town, that gives them something to weigh. And is there any way to find what the financial savings would be to see? There has to be a break point where it's worth doing it. Is there to be a cost on hopefully town savings and school savings? And if so, the school could expect to get X amount more to help
I mean, again,
improve the product.
I think you could get to the, you know, you could get a ballpark of what the financial impact is. I'm not sure you can get to precision until you know what the educational plan is specifically, but you could clearly get into a ballpark and get into a, you know, a range of, you know, your plus or minus some percent of what you think the ultimate outcome is going to be. But to get to a precision, you know, you need to just know what that educational plan is. Then you have a series of policy questions everybody's got to agree on, which is, you know, what you're talking about is basically a revenue sharing plan. Mm-hmm. And, you know, you have to sit and agree on that. And whether or not you want to make that as a commitment forever, whether or not you want to, you know, how you make that commitment and how that goes, was something that you would hash
But
out.
that's all part of negotiations,
Yeah.
that they're in control of their property, and they're gonna look for something to improve their charge of providing the best quality education they can.
Can I jump in here? Some of that's cart before the horse. We're negotiating something we don't even know exists, I get, from my perspective. I'll try to keep it short. Everybody in town's got a boss. It's called the budget. At the end of the day, everybody, you can't overspend your budget. There's certain things that are facing this town, not the school system, but they are part of the problem. They are part of the situation. This building isn't going to last forever. The last quote I heard from you was to scratch it and do another one's $20 million. Okay, I have about as much interest in doing that as shooting myself at this point in time. The maintenance building over there needs dramatic work. Our streets need dramatic work. Our seawalls need dramatic work. You'd have a hard time finding something in this town from a capital perspective that doesn't need work. And if we continue to go as we're going, we are going to continue to lower the value of this town, lower the appeal of this town, because the infrastructure is going to crumble. And we do not have, $345,000 is a spit in a bucket for what we're trying to accomplish. I look at this board here as it's my understanding, our charge is to look forward, to develop strategies, to discuss strategies, to look at opportunities, to how do we take this town and make it a growing concern, not 2 years from now, not 5 years from now, but we ought to be planning 10 and 15 years from now anyway. The school department's very fond of saying, well, that one of their quotes to me was, well, John, we have to look 25, 30 years in advance, as to what the population's going to be, to which my response was, the last 25 years is all it's done to go down. So, I mean, there's some realities that have to be grabbed in this whole situation. For starters, everybody participates in the whole of the town. We can't throw all of the money towards the schools, nor would I suggest we throw all of the money towards capital expenses. But there has to be downstream an understanding that I might have the greatest school in a not very exciting town, and I'm still going to have trouble getting families with children to move to it, because there's not a lot that, once they get out of school, what do they have to do? So I'm kind of looking at this as, we have maintenance building, the town hall, our roads, our sewage department, our sewage plant. These things are going to break. There's no question about it. And just by going through what we just went through, we can't afford any of those things. So my philosophy is we have to, uncomfortable as it may be, with the total recognition, we can't go to the school and say, you're going to do this. But right now, we don't know what we're asking them to do. We don't have a plan in place. Every time you bring it up, someone goes, oh, that'll cost too much. Well, what's too much? Aren't we planning for our future? Isn't it nice to know what it is? Shelf life. Okay, maybe the shelf life's 3 to 5 years. Generally speaking, the design of the building isn't going to change that much 5 years to 10 years. It's just going to be a question of how much more does it cost for raw materials and labor, would be my guess at this point in time. So I think it is our charge to look, if the school department's looking 25 years, then by golly, we ought to be. That's our job, is to figure out where this town is going. And the only way you can figure out where you're going is if you have knowledge. We're talking about, well, a school department might, what about if we ask them to do this? Well, negotiation 101 says you don't ask somebody how they feel about it and take a no and go, well, it was a good idea. This has to be a buy-in process from everybody in town. And on a relatively small basis, because we get terrible voters show up in May, what voters showed up said, I'd like to see the study. I'm not suggesting that the study means we're going to do it. I'm suggesting the study gives us knowledge. It gives the school department power. It gives us power, because knowledge is power. We know what we're looking at. Let's say next year something untoward happens and this building has a major calamity. Where are we going to come up with $20 million? We're not. So, if we don't have these facts and figures and plan in place, then shame on us. Our job's to do that. And if we're not going to do that job, we shouldn't have this job.
So you're saying,
That's kind of how I look at it, is like.
so you want to be one of those 2 members? Do you want to go with me to meet with the school committee and craft that?
Sure, I would love to do that.
Okay.
The point is, it's got to be, and I'm not going to say it's got to be sold or it's got to be positioned, because those are all the wrong words to use. This is a reality. Obviously, Eric, in your department, I totally get why you don't want to do it. I do. I went to a school, lived in a town that only had 2 schools. I've met a lot of people who have. A lot of people hated it. A lot of people. There is no good equation here, but the other side of the equation, the other side of that coin is, there's no good equation for the town we live in either. We have to figure out a partnership that's going to work. We have to. You can't, the school department can't keep spending and can't, this is mine. Well, mine may drive us broke.
Just do one follow-up to John?
And then I get Kevin, yeah.
Just, in my comments, I predicated that on, we were already presented with their own study, which they said, basically, they couldn't do it educationally, or was not good for the students. So that's why if you go to them and what you said to me makes perfect sense, but if you go to them saying that to them, they're still gonna, I'd like to see us go with something, consider this, please join us with an open mind. If we just come in and say, we know you did this study, but we're going to do the study anyways, we're going to force you to come to the table, it's not going to have them drift to the center. I'd like us to be in the center and moving forward, but, you know, that's what my comments were based on. I see where you're coming from, but I just don't well in reality. So
None of these decisions are comfortable. Nobody wants to do them. And you have a group of, a group that says, this is my responsibility and I don't want to do it, end of discussion.
Yeah, just to be fair to them,
That's not the other side of the equation either.
they haven't said that, you know, they absolutely don't want to discuss it. They just said educationally at this point, because I've spoken to Mary Ann Hart, the chair of this week, and she's interested in having the conversation. And so, you know, she's reached out and said, I'm fully willing to have this conversation, as well as, you know, other members. So, you know, it's not that they don't want to participate, but at their last presentation that they did in April, you know, they just said at this point, it doesn't look like educationally it's in the best interest, but we certainly are willing to have the conversation. So, Mr. Richardson?
Yeah, I mean, I get John's point, but I guess one of the tough questions is if you know, consolidating the schools would save money and would be a cost avoidance, but at the same time, it was proven that it was not beneficial to children, do you still move forward with that? Because my answer would be no. Yours may be yes, it's a savings. Mine would be no. I have children in the school. I'm a firm believer that, you know, the reputation of a town is based on the quality of its schools. I think the schools have demonstrated over the last, you know, number of years that they've shown improvement. They've demonstrated some results. I think that, you know, we look at the charter school tuition, that's been going down. They've done a good job of bringing kids back. The number of kids at private school has gone down. That would cost money if they went. But at the same time, the reality is that there's less kids in town. And it's not a result of they're leaving our school system. There's less kids being born into town. I think one thing that I'd like to see is to put a group together. It may be that the first step is to do the educational component again, but to have an outside person. I've talked to the superintendent a year ago, 2 years ago, and I said to her point blank, it may be that an outside group comes in and says the exact 20 things that you presented to us in that meeting, because they, you know, when Principal Devine spoke, he made perfect sense, and you couldn't really argue with his justifications for why educationally it wasn't beneficial. But there is that, well, that's our school system, you know, that's our principal. Of course he's going to say that. You hire an outside group, and they may give those 20 things, but you'd get more buy-in based on that. So part of me says, let's start with just that one piece of it. But I think one of the things we want out of this group, you know, to come to an agreement on is maybe there's a trigger that when enrollment gets to a certain point, that triggers, you know what, now it makes sense to do a study. And I don't know what that number is. It's, you know, it's a little below 1,100. You know, maybe the school department decides that if it was 950 kids, we could justify it in such a way. And maybe the trigger is when we get to 1,000 students that we do a study. Doesn't mean we go forward on it, but if it's continuing to trend down at that point, I am concerned about just doing the study with the staleness we talk about. Look no further than we rebuilt these schools. The reason the schools are the size they are is we hired a company. If you look at those, what they projected the school-age children to be, we should be demanding our money back, because it's, yeah, I agree that if we ever went forward with this and we went from 3 schools to 2, we do have to think about, well, what if we do get to a point where people start having more children and now we're overcrowded? And again, look no further than, you weren't here at the time, but we used to have 2 elementary schools. We closed one, we converted it to condos at Damon Place. Less than 10 years later, we had portable classrooms in a parking lot. We were using Hog Island, which is Spinnaker Island, for classroom. We were doing staggered schedules. And we said, why did we close that school? And we were overcrowded, and then it's gone the other way. So there are these cycles. I think you do have to look 25 years, but at the same time, we had a study done that in 2 years was just so far off, and people say you were crazy for building a school that big, but we paid people money to tell us what size school to build. And
Fair to those, not to be fair to the studies, but to be fair to the process. The studies were dictated, we had to do the studies.
Correct.
By the School Building
Right.
Administrative Bureau, which is and they were the ones who vetted the people who do the studies. So they had a list of 5 or 6 firms, and they said, look, you've got to pick one of these 5 or 6 firms to do your demographic study, and you cannot file an application to renovate your schools or do anything in the SBA, whether you want to renovate or just do substantial improvements. You renovate and add versus substantial improvements. They had 2 components to the program. One was just to do roofs and windows, and the other was to do renovations, full-bore renovations and additions. And the SBAB was the entity that said, look, here are the firms that are vetted by the state to do demographic
We
studies.
used the Mount Vernon group, didn't we?
yeah, it was Mount Vernon. But, getting back to Phil's point, we're not going to see a huge spike in 1 year. I see it in my business every day that when you look at some of our test scores, we're very close to, when I hear a young family moving from out of state or whatever, and, they want to look in Norwell, Hingham, it's because of the schools. It's not because of their beach or bay or whatever. And we're closer to those points. Hull has a very good school system. I'm proud that I have 4 kids in that schools. I think the improvement has been, I don't want to say dramatic, but I think it's been incremental. So if I was a young family, when I look at prices, I look at this view we have on both sides every day, I'd choose Hull over Hingham if I was choosing. But if 10 more families move into town today, it's 10 more kids, or, that would be a 10 to 12 year process. So I think we do have to set a number on, look, if it continues down, even though we're making all these improvements, even though we're bringing more kids back, then I think, that's part of the agreement that the school committee says, well, that's the trigger. For whatever reason, people just aren't having kids. There's more elderly people. There's more people with no children or whatever. But I think the first step is to meet with them and to, kind of hammer some of that stuff out before we just jump in and spend the money now.
Harkening back to that meeting that we had last spring, and what ultimately town meeting voted on, I think, and you guys have each kind of touched upon it, and I think what I keep thinking about is, yes, we heard from the school department, we've heard from the administrators and their thoughts educationally of what this meant, but what we didn't hear was the outside opinion to that. And that was a lot of what I heard in that meeting in the presentation room, on the 2nd floor at the high school back then, was that people, when we were talking about this, and a lot of the school committee at that time, I was hearing some nodding of heads at that point. It's like, okay, yeah, I kind of see that. Granted, it was still on the negative side towards doing the study, but I think that, for me, that was an important thing to hear, is that I wanted to hear from someone else other than our own internal look at things. Because, you do get that bit of parochialness that you talked about, Kevin, that, it's my school and this is how we feel. So, and, you're also right in that this outside group may say the exact same 20 things.
But you'll
They
get
may
buy-in
not.
that way.
What's that?
You'd get buy-in that way because it's an outside group.
That's right.
It doesn't
That's
make
right.
sense because you're going to spend money to
That's right.
potentially get the same results, but.
Yeah, that's right. So that's kind of the thing I hope you think about and remember. The discussion that you're having now is great, and I'm really happy to hear it, and in terms of how we move forward from here, though.
To answer your question that you posed to me,
It was more a hypothetical, it wasn't posed directly to you.
y'all want to paper me anti-school and anti-kid,
And that wasn't
knock
the
yourself out. But that is not who I am. That's not why I'm taking this position whatsoever. I'm taking this position because we don't have the knowledge, enough knowledge and enough facts to come back and say, there's no way that we're going to do this. This would be detrimental to the town. Then I'm all over it. Then it's called, okay, where do we go from here? What's next? Because if we just stand still, we're going nowhere.
Okay, at the risk of being unpopular, I support the school committee's decision. I was on the building committee, when we looked at the schools, they were built specifically for the age group, they were built specifically for what they intended to do, and I think they've done that. Now, having said that, there was another side of that, and that is that at that time we knew that the addition to the Jacob School was bigger than was necessary. That was known when it was done. However, the people there were very crowded, and they were looking at other ways to use that space in terms of which they have done with the collaborative and other groups. But they knew it was going to be bigger than they needed at that time. They also knew that the high school was bigger than they needed at that time, because one of the things they looked at, and John, you were on the committee too, they looked at tearing down the high school and rebuilding it, and the estimated space that would be needed for that number of students was smaller than the current space, and so therefore the decision was made to redo it instead of tear it down and rebuild it, because they couldn't have the same space that they had. Okay. Now, having said all of that, one of the things that concerns me is what I keep hearing is an either-or situation. The school committee give it away, basically, never having access to it again, and having the town take it over, or keep it. Is there any way to have a conversation about, if there is extra space now in some areas, utilizing that, sharing the space without actually declaring it surplus or giving it away? Maybe there is a top floor of the Memorial School or part of the Jacob School that perhaps could be used for town hall or other things with minor renovations. So what I haven't heard is that kind of conversation. Is there something? I know, but is there? I haven't heard it tonight. Yeah, right. But is right? But I mean, is there some way in the middle to start there and say, is there space that we could use now, and then look at, maybe some kind of negotiation, so that we're not talking about an either-or kind of situation. But again, the schools were created specifically designed for the groups of students that are currently there. And they weren't designed for other groups of students. The Jacob School was not designed to have the science labs for a middle school. They weren't designed to have, the cafeteria, the auditorium for a middle school. It wasn't designed that way. And so you're really talking about really having to change a lot of your educational goals and perspectives if you are to put students from one place into a place that it wasn't designed for. So again, I think there is extra space, but I think that we need to start small and maybe look at sharing space as a goal instead of total, giving up the space.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to recognize Mr. Lemios, and then what I'll do, John, is I'll reach out to Mary Ann Hart, try to get a date. You and I can meet with her, and, whoever she would like to bring in, and go from there.
Yeah, I think, again, part of what, if you're going to go forward with a study, you also have to go forward, in my estimation, on a basis of, maybe a little more flexibility or rationality. So I've heard this discussion from time to time about, for instance, 7th grade at Jacobs. And I've never understood why you would put a 7th grade at Jacobs, because you'd then have to create labs. And a typical, and I've quite frankly never heard of really an elementary school being K through 7. I've heard them be K through 6. And I know that there are high schools that are 7 through 12. And so I think that, this proposal had always envisioned, at least, in part, that you would say, okay, you do K through 6 at Jacobs, and you do 7 through 12 at the high school, and that would allow you to take advantage of the amenities that are at high school that are more consistent with the middle school need than obviously in an elementary school. So I think that, as the discussion develops over time, with the school committee, I mean, I think that, to set the parameters, if you are going to study, to set the parameters as to what is kind of a consistent educational models in other communities. And there are communities that are running K through 6 systems in 7 through 12 schools. There's no question about that. There are. Right. And, well, it's also the way it is in other communities today. So that model is there. The question that, I was alluding to at the beginning of the conversation is in my mind, you can study, and I think there's one way to study it, which is, should we do it? And it's a should word. And there's another way to study it, which is how to do it. And, there's this very big distinction between should and how. And I think John is arguing in part for the how. How would you go about doing this? Versus should we do it? Because I think you can spend a lot of time on the should and never get to the how. And I think you fall into the should category if you don't have partners that are all invested in making something happen. So
Should's a tough word. Should isn't an emotional word. That
Yes.
means we do this, we're going to do this.
Yeah.
I'm not advocating, and I am not advocating that. I never have advocated that. I just want to know what the facts are.
Right.
So that we can make a better decision.
And in order to get to those facts, you need to have everybody desiring to get to the facts. Because how you structure the contract, is very, very important. What you're asking people to study and how you determine what you're going to study will either get you to that set of facts or not. Because, we've got tons of studies here, and lots of other communities have, stacks of studies everywhere. And there's lots of studies in government agencies all over the place that were done for the purposes of doing a study. And I think if you really look at the underlying intent, it was a study to get past the political moment. And my argument is if you don't have people that really want to look at it with an open mind and go at it with an open mind, if people are against it, they're against it. And, that's their charge and so forth. And if you then create a study without having an open mind to it, I think you're going to get a study that sits on a shelf. So I think the first thing that, the committee of two needs to kind of address with their counterparts is, is this going to be a study of an open mind? Or if the school committee and the administrators really don't want to do it, then they need to have the political courage to say, we don't want to do it. We don't think it's in the best interest of the community. But right now, it's an ambivalent response. The administrators clearly said they don't want to do it. The school committee, some school committee members are saying, yeah, I kind of think we could do it. Others are saying, no, I don't want to do it. But that's not an answer.
I'm going to go to Mr. Hipp, then I'm going to go to Mr. Riley, and then I'm going to move on.
Sure, no, thank you. I just want to be clear, I'm here tonight, I'm certainly a member of the school committee, but I am not representing the entire school committee. I appreciate this discussion. Once I saw it on the agenda, I figured this was something I wanted to be at to listen to, and I appreciate a lot of the comments and the whole discussion. I also appreciate Mr. Oliveri specifically noting to Ms. Hart recently, but it's been long-standing that the school committee is ready, willing, and able to discuss this, has been since we had the meeting back in April. I think there were even two meetings. There was one in March and one in April. And we are perfectly happy to have a discussion of whatever you like at any time.
Thank you. Mr. Riley?
To Phil, any chance we get some preliminary estimates as to what each aspect of the study would cost? I mean, I know you threw out 150, but I've heard prices ranging from 50 up to 150 that you said today.
The accounting piece and the space study piece is, I could get probably a fairly solid number for, who I do for the space studies piece, I'd call AI3, the people who designed the schools. They do space studies. So they clearly have an in-depth knowledge of all the plans and all the schools, and, they're up to date with latest educational, protocols and requirements and so forth. I mean, they are one of the state's designated school design bodies, so they clearly know what all the educational standards are, and they know these buildings. We were their first and only client.
Now they're not returning your call.
And so they know the buildings, they know the plans, and they'd have, they have a very, very, their learning curve would not be particularly steep at all. So I think I would get AI3 to do the space study, and the financial piece of it, I don't think is particularly exotic. We can get, Melanson Heath or one of the big accounting firms that does municipal accounting to do the, kind of forensic audit work, or whatever the proper term is, prospective audit work, to kind of figure out the cost piece of it. The educational component, again, comes down to, how many fingers are going to design that study, what exactly are you going to study, and how broad is it going to be? And that part I can't give you an estimate on, with any clarity until I kind of know, what exactly is the nature of that study. Because I think there are some differences in the way you can approach it. I think if you approach it, if you had everybody on board at this stage, the study would be just simply, how do you make this happen? What do you need to do to make it happen? But I'm not sure that's where the educational community in the town is, because the administrators were clearly, no, this should not happen. It doesn't make sense. But the school committee, I guess, is saying they're willing to go contrary to the opinion of the administrators and say, yeah, we're willing to discuss it. I don't know, I think that's what they're saying. The administrators were emphatic, they don't want to do it. So I'm not sure, I think that will derive, I guess, what the study looks like. I don't know. I mean, I don't know what the role of the administrators are relative to the school committee, I guess, is willing to have the discussion, even though the administrators didn't want to do it.
So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna just end it there. John, and like I said, I'll get a hold of Mary and Hart, and we'll try to get it